I'm going to speak is something which is always very close to my heart. And I say it's very close to my heart because this is something I usually, this theoretical dimension with which I engaged my research, my PhD. And also I have been thinking, rethinking, working, learning and sharing on these perspectives for quite a long time now. So this is why I always talk, or I always share that this is something very near to my heart. So today what I'm going to speak about is post-colonization versus decolonization, the Indian story. Now, this is not the first time I'm speaking about post-colonization or decolonization. Even a few weeks back, I was talking about decolonization and, within the premise of Indian myth, history, and several other elements. Today, what I'm going to basically talk about, it's a very rooted issue which I have been grappling with since the time I have engaged with this notion of post-colonization and decolonization. It is something I have been grappling with. Now, when I say grappling with, I mean that at the very outset, I would like to clarify a few things to all the listeners here. That I have not come here to indoctrinate anybody. I have not come here to say that, I'm not going to give you 10 or 12 parameters that, okay, let us follow this and we will be able to decolonize our existence. I'm not going to say that. What I'm basically going to do is with respect to my experiences, with my life experiences, with respect to my understandings and whatever I have understood since my childhood days from my respective social, cultural, political, personal positionality with respect to my country, within my social culture, I'm going to share some of the thoughts that how post-colonization is different from decolonization. And also I'm going to, in the course of my lecture, I'm going to argue that why decolonization should be adopted as a counter argument to the notion of post-colonization. Now, moving into my slides. So what I'm going to share with you right now is the lecture planner. So I'm going to divide my lecture basically into three parts. So first, I'm going to talk about, as I say, my respective positionality experiences, what notions of post-colonization and decolonization. And then I'm going to argue in the second part that why we need to revisit the existing notions from experiential applications. And having argued these two components theoretically and practically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about that why the very existing notions of post-colonization should be decolonized. Now here, so the first thing that I'm going to talk about is what is post-colonization. Now, my first encounter with the term post-colonial, as far as I remember, was respect to some of my history books that I first started studying in my school days. And obviously the context of my encountering was post-colonial history of Bengal, post-colonial history of India, post-colonial world history, and several other continental post-colonial histories that we used to be taught in our schools by the various textbooks. My first encounter with this very term, post-colonial, emerged from this, number one. Now, when I was learning about the different dimensions of post-colonial or what is the meaning of post-colonial, obviously our questions, our arguments emerge from the notion of colonial. What is to be being colonized? Or what are the dimensions of colonization? Now, when I was learning the dimensions of colonization, it was mostly based on various forms of public uprisings, various forms of anti-imperialist movements, various forms of revolutions, slave trade, border disputes, physical displacements. So my point is, in a nutshell, the basic things that we were learning about the term post-colonial were all from physical dimensions. That the colonizers came, they physically enslaved us, they established a physical empire, and then finally what happened is we were colonized. And even if I just speak within the Indian dimension, just very specific to the general Indian dimension, that how European colonizers colonized us, how European invaders colonized us. With respect to that particular perspective, to see is that this element of post-colonization was mostly taught to us from a very physical dimension. We were physically colonized, physical enslavement, physical tortures, etc., from a very physical dimension, most of the times. And when did I understand or encounter the term decolonial? Obviously, in the school textbooks, it was not a very commonly used term. Even in interesting parts that it was mostly used. I have highlighted it was used like slash or you say decolonial. Now, I problematic. So it was just a so to overcome this process of colonization is we physically refuted European colonization on them. And third thing that was to me or to maybe other people out there, that post-colonization means after colonization, or in simplest or the simplest terms, the death of colonization. So colonization is over, we have this era of post-colonization. Now, with this very historical understanding, with the passage of time, when I start engaging with elements of college research and hereafter, right now, still I'm doing, I'm continue with it. What are some of the problems I gradually started realizing with this very notion of post-colonialism or post-colonization? Now, some of the problems that I noticed were that first is that these very historical narratives that we were fed with at that time was very unidirectional and stereotypical historical narratives. Why it is unidirectional and stereotypical? Because it only specifically, or to be not to be generalized, but to say that, you know, prominently it mostly focused on the notion of physical colonial dimensions. But with the passage of time, if we think about it deeply, and which actually decolonization makes us think very prominently, that colonization was not just physical colonization. It was ideological colonization. In other words, it was not only the body that was colonized. Those of you who have been engaging with these premises, you must have heard of this famous book's, famous name of this particular famous book, that is Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi Thiong'o, where Thiong'o categorically argues that even before the body was colonized, it was the mind which was colonized. So simply focusing on the physical colonial dimensions was very problematic. Point number two, hierarchical and distracting narratives. Now, most of the historical books, I'm speaking at a very basic level. I'm speaking from what we are taught in the schools, because that is from where we start encountering histories. We start learning histories and philosophies, etc. So in the very school books, we also find that freedom struggles were focused, certain definite freedom struggles were focused on certain specific groups of privileges of who had the privilege of caste, class, gender, religion, race, economy, all these elements. So certain groups, the privileged groups who fought against the British or other European colonizers, their stories are being projected at the cost of others. This is the second problem that we used to encounter, that freedom struggles only talking about the freedom struggles of certain specific groups who always enjoyed or who have been enjoying and still enjoy certain political, racial, class, caste, gender, communal privileges in our country. And I'm speaking specifically focusing in India. Third one, masquerading narratives. That is, in the process of exclusively focusing on the physical elements of colonization, the problems that are happening is there are certain metaphysical colonial practices as well. And what I mean by metaphysical, let me clarify at the very outset. It is not the spiritual sense of metaphysics. I am talking of the metaphysical in the notion or with the notion that is beyond physical. Physical, metaphysical, beyond physical. So ignoring the metaphysical colonial practices, that is how our mind, our habits, our food practices, our body languages, our verbal languages, and so many dimensions were colonized in the process. But because just focusing or mostly focusing on the physical dimensions actually distracts us and masquerades these underlying narratives as well. And the fourth major problem which I encountered or which I identified in the process was misdirectional narratives. That is, interpreting colonization or interpreting post-colonization as a notion of after-colonization is very problematic, because still today, in terms of our habitual practices, we see it is very much prominent. Maybe we don't have a physical empire right now. Maybe we don't see white people whipping us, but we have their ideologies, we have their reflections. Their scepters keep us haunting with the people around us. It is the natives who colonize the other natives. So this metaphysical element, so this very misdirectional belief that colonization is over is again very problematic. And I argue that these problematic narratives, this set of problematic narratives have emerged because of our wrong reading of our own histories, because of our failure to understand the multi-dimensional perspectives of our histories. So this is where decolonization pitches in. And with respect to this, actually, I am transcending to the second part of my lecture. Now, obviously, I have already briefly mentioned at the very outset of my lecture that I'm going to speak from some of my experiential narratives. And why I am doing it from my own experiential narratives, or why I was sharing these kind of anecdotes with you all, it is so because I believe that these kind of anecdotes will actually enable you to realize that, you see, the kind of narratives that I'm sharing with you is with respect to my own position, with respect to my own experiences. It is not necessary that you have to agree with me, and I'm very much welcome with disagreements. So you can disagree, because I personally or very strongly believe a version of or a form of decolonization exercise is not to agree with each other, but to mostly disagree with each other, which always gives us a premise for new dimensions of thinking and doing. So this is why whatever I'm speaking is with respect to my experiences. Now, having said that, coming to the second part of our lecture, that is, what does decolonization asks us to do? Or how does decolonization helps us? Now, the first thing is, now here, as I say, that I am using the notion, or I am pitching in the notion of decolonization as a counter narrative of colonization. And also, I briefly argued that colonization is not only a physical exercise, was not only a physical exercise, it is also a kind of metaphysical exercise as well. This is why we have the concept of colonialism, colonization, and today we have coloniality, we have neocolonialism, and so many and so forth. I mean, if colonization would have been over, then this notion of coloniality would never have existed. So decolonization, actually, first of all, and also one more thing, prior to going to this notion of decolonization, it is important for us to remember that it is very difficult to make a division between colonization and decolonization in a very clear-cut manner. So we just can't draw a line on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. We just can't write opposite sides. There are lots of points of convergences and divergences. That we have to remember. So it is not only about, it is not just about that decolonization is the ultimate solution and post-colonization has no solution. No, it is not about that. There are lots of points of convergences and divergences. So we have to identify each and every components as holistically as possible. Now, de-hierarchizing and indigenizing our own self. So decolonization, what I argue is, enables us to indulge in a series of varieties of de-hierarchical and indigenous exercises. So what are the different types of exercises that helps us to enable us to engage with? First is de-hierarchizing and indigenizing our own self. So first thing, before even we point out to others that you are colonized, this is how you need to decolonize yourself or post-colonize yourself, whatever we say, it is important for us to question ourselves, to reflect upon ourselves, meditate upon ourselves, that how much we are decolonized. So this exercise of decolonization doesn't start with the other, it starts with the self exercises. First, as an individual, I need to realize, I need to question, I need to deeply think, self-meditate. Then after thinking, I need to deeply reflect and then deeply question my own self, that if I am decolonized at all, or what do I understand by decolonization from my own perspective. And I need to realize that what are the various dimensions of my colonial self, because colonization, the process of colonization, as I said, it was not only a physical colonization, but it was also a metaphysical colonization. The point is, this very element, this very perspective has been so well ingrained within us, psychologically ingrained, even before physically ingrained, psychologically ingrained within us, that we, most of the times, we don't realize the kind of body language that we share with others, the way we speak, the way we eat, the way we dress, the way we walk and talk, they're often reflections or mimic. It's often a blind mimicry of colonial attitudes. It often happens with us, and we don't realize that. So that is why the first process is de-hierarchizing and indigenizing our own self. It starts with self-exercise first. Point number 2, de-hierarchizing and indigenizing our understandings of colonial and post-colonial elements. The point is, you see, when we say colonial and post-colonial histories, now this is a very problematic space, let me tell you. Now these things sounds wonderful, isn't it? Localizing the globe, globalizing the local, global. We formulate so many terminologies, so many perspectives, so many dimensions. But again, as I said to you, that in my second part, we have to look into the element of exercise, the element of application. Now, how to apply them? It's very easy to say local, global, this and that, and so many terminologies, and people signing petitions with respect to their terminologies, etc., getting prizes. But what about the applicability when we come out of the classroom, when we come out of the lecture sessions? What to do? How to apply it? So now coming to the question of application, what we see here is that this localizing the globe and globalizing the local. Now localizing the globe means, now with respect to whatever we learn across the globe, different cultures, different traditions, different theories, different philosophies we are learning every time. Whenever we are learning, our effort, our focus should be that how to apply it. How to apply it in our real life. How can we apply? How can we project it in our real life? Now, it may be possible, it may not be possible. Everything cannot be applied everywhere. It's not possible for all of us. But that effort should be there. Simply blindly mimicking because something Foucault has said, something Lacan has said, something Marx has said, something Heidegger has said, or someone else has said, just because they have said and we have to imbibe it and we have to forcefully apply it, that has to be avoided. We need to think that only the valuability will be existing, only the valuable part will come to existence when we go into the case of application. How to apply it? If you're able to apply it, how to apply it? If you're not able to apply it, why we are failing to apply it? All these questions of yes and no's actually lead to the multidimensionality of understanding. And that is how new thoughts, new dimensions, new perspectives emerge from the local. Now, I being from Bengal, I have a specific understanding. I may have a specific understanding of Marx. People from Kerala might have a specific understanding from Marx. People from Punjab, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh might have a specific understanding of Marx. We need to acknowledge those differences. That is very important. And these differences only arises when we try to understand a particular global notion within a specific context. Similarly, we have to indulge in the vice versa exercise as well. That is globalizing the local. That is how our local thoughts, our local perspectives, our local dimensions can be applied across the globe and wherever it is applicable. How it is applicable and how it is not applicable, we have to be open for both yes and no's. Otherwise, what will happen is, or what usually happens is, we go ahead, we turn into chauvinists, we enforce our cultural practices somewhere else, and ultimately what we end up doing is the colonial exercise, the same colonial exercise in different names, in different perspectives, etc. And when we try to indulge in this kind of exercise, a whole new open raw world open in front of us. And what is that? We realize in the process of this exercise that colonization is not over. And there is this, quite famous historian from South Africa. His name is Sabelo J. Ndlevukatsini, whom I often quote in my writings and during my lectures as well. He has, analyzed this very notion, which I have put in quotations actually, this very notion of the coloniality in three broad dimensions. He said that there are three types of coloniality widely: coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being. And when we indulge in this kind of exercises, when we go through these various experiential elements, we come into conflicts of ideologies, new thoughts, new ideas, new versions of disagreements. This a whole new world open in front of us. And then more and more we are convinced, more and more we realize the fact that you see this coloniality of power, this coloniality of knowledge, and this coloniality of being is very much there. And if we have to indulge in any kind of, decolonial exercise, what is really, really important for us is to realize these first elements of coloniality. We need to start from the root. Without realizing how and from which different perspectives we are still colonized, it is impossible for us to decolonize. That's why this exercise of revisiting, re-understanding, and also dismantling, that is, we say unlearn to relearn, dismantling old thoughts and reorienting and re-understanding new dimensions is very important. The third major element of decolonization exercise is, as I've been talking about, is de-hierarchizing and indigenizing the systems of knowledge production. Now, again, this question of knowledge production is actually something, again, it's very wide. Where to start, where to stop? The question is that, you see, now when I talk about, here I have bracketed different elements or different ways of, decolonizing the knowledge systems of knowledge production that exists around us. One is decolonizing the schools and the universities. That is now how to do or decolonizing the school and the universities. We see that often, especially with respect to many private institutions, I won't generalize, create a dimension or a hierarchical dimension between private and the public, but mostly with respect to my working and educational experiences so far, in the private institutions, infrastructurally, now when I say infrastructurally, it is like both physically and ideologically, they always create spaces of exclusivity. You will see in terms of fee structures, in terms of hostels, in terms of food messes, in terms of classroom structures, in terms of roll number alignments, there is always a tendency of creating exclusive compartments that certain elitist people or certain elitist students from certain elitist backgrounds will fit certain boxes, and those who are non-elitist in terms of their financial structure, in terms of their attitude, they are pushed into the other box. And maybe that is sometimes done physically. Mostly they are actually or mostly done in terms of in a metaphysical manner. So decolonizing the schools and the university spaces in terms of physical infrastructures, in terms of the fee structures, in terms of reorienting or de-hierarchizing those spaces is very important. And I'm pretty sure those who work in the private, I'm pretty sure they will be able to understand, or they are very much aware of it. Now, apart from this, now I will come to this point of decolonizing the museums a bit later. I'll jump into decolonizing the curriculum. Now, this another element of a very colonial structured education system is very much reflecting the curricular structure. When we look into the curricular structure, we see the kind of, we always, we have this, tendency of worshipping by default, worshipping the theorists who emerged from the colonial West by default. So people, the point is, for anything immediately they have to refer to a Derrida. For anything immediately they have a Sartre, they have a, Foucault, they have a Lacan in their mind. But how many of us, to be very honest, how many of us really consciously indulge with indigenous theorists all around? And also it is a, it is a kind of, what to say, it's a, it's a very cool, as we say, cool quote unquote, that you immediately refer to a few Western names and you have a very good public impression. Oh my God, this person reads and learns a lot. But unfortunately, indulging ourselves in such kind of exercises actually exposes our naivety, exposes that how much we are deep. Actually, Gugi Thiongo argues as dismembered from our own cultures and traditions. And we do it deliberately. We do it in a way, we do it in a process, in a very happy manner. We have this, kind of show off thing, we indulge in a kind of show off business just by quoting the Western scholars here and there. And this is actually, some of the decolonial scholars often argue it as a Tower of Babel. And if you just read a bit of the Tower of Babel, if you read the history, it's a long history, so I won't be able to share with you here. If you read, the Tower of Babel is used as a metaphor of representing of that, one single knowledge system as curated by the European colonizers once upon a time. That is only their system of knowledge, their ways of speaking, their languages are authentic, and rest are all inauthentic. They are dehuman, they are uncivilized. So in the process, what is happening is we have this reflection very much in the curricular structures as well. Things are changing. Right now, things are changing very much. We see there is a lot of focus on tribal literatures. We see there is a lot of focus on indigenous literatures. But even 10 years back, if you reflect, I mean, if you don't know Shakespeare, if you don't know a Derrida, if you don't know, or you are unable to understand Marx in the classroom, it means you're blunt-headed, you're stupid, you're an idiot. Often the teachers will say you that you are not fit for being an English student. It happened with my experiences. It happened in my classroom back in my university. I have no problem in sharing that, and I'm sharing things from my own experience. So these, these chauvinistic, typical, mimicking attitude has to be dismantled in terms of the curricular structures as well. We need to acknowledge these differences. We need to be happy sharing that I don't understand because it is not in a part of my context. I need to recontextualize it. And then obviously, when we grow a bit further, it is also when we move into the world of research. And now when I mean by the world of research, I'm not just talking of the concept of PhD. I mean, PhD is just a degree research, but when we venture into the world of research, do a PhD and then we do on projects and different things, it is important for us to decolonize and indigenize the research methodologies as well. That is how, within different contexts, we have, it's very easygoing, isn't it? We have this research methodology books. It talks about scientific research. It talks about logical research. It talks about statistical research. But how many of us have really questioned ever that what is the notion of a scientific research in humanities? What is the notion of a scientific research in social sciences? How can we have a hypothesis in a humanitarian context? How many of us questions these? It is important right now to question and apply. And the process have already started. I don't know how many of you know this story. I think it was back in 2019 or 18, and it was most probably in the University of Washington, which created a lot of hue and cry, obviously, at the initial stage, that a PhD student who was working in comics, he wrote his entire, he or she, I don't exactly remember, that person, that research scholar wrote exactly the thesis. The research scholar has wrote the entire, thesis as a comic strip. And obviously, I mean, when it went to the PhD committee, it created a hue and cry, people talking about principalities, ethics, and moralities, etc. But at the end, it was accepted. That is how you decolonize research. I know, a very eminent professor from the Syracuse University. In most of our papers, if you read the research papers, usually what is our tendency? We divide the research papers into different segments, and the last segment by default is conclusion, isn't it? We write a conclusion and then we conclude. Most of the times she writes non-conclusion. That is how you bring decolonization or decoloniality into practice. Now the problem is here the question of acceptability. It doesn't happen on a single day. It's very easy to say, but even if you look at my PhD thesis, I don't see, or I don't think that I have indulged into, or I could have brought, but I could successfully bring a lot of decolonizing writing practices in my thesis. The acceptability is always a question, and if you try to do, you will be made fun of by the institution, or might be your supervisor simply might say that this is not the way to do, or we can't do it, or we just can't change it. But somewhere, somewhat, we have to collectively push into these transformations. It's very important. And then apart from it, we have, the rural-urban divides we see currently with respect to the scenario, especially during this pandemic of COVID-19, the digital divide, the problem already existed. It is coming out more and more. Gender divides are also in the, pandemic of COVID-19 is coming out more and more. Who controls knowledge is still a big question from the gender perspective. Who are the voices of this knowledge production across the world? And then another place which actually delivers a lot of knowledge, and which actually is often a very fond place for visiting. I'm pretty sure many of you must be, in love with visiting museums. Decolonizing the museums is also very important. I give you one small example actually. If you go to the British Museum ever in UK, you will find something interesting. The interesting part is, now you must be knowing the story that the most of the artifacts that the British Museum have from the African continent, they're all stolen by the colonizers. And they're such shameless creatures that they don't even, have this guts to return it. Even to today, they don't have this bloody guts to return them back. So if you go to the British Museum, what you will see is the interesting part. There, most of the countries of Africa, like most of the artifacts, African artifacts, have been presented at the basement. I think you will find only Egypt or one or two other countries in the second or the third floor. And then rest of all the African countries are in the basement. So you see, organizing the museum, organizing the artifacts in the museum is also an element of racial, cultural, colonial politics. And till date, several African works in general from the works from the African continent, questions this structure, that why all the African continents are in the basement. And it shows a very typical European colonial attitude, that how they were always trampled under the feet of the colonizers. So they get the lowest position in that particular building. They get architecturally, they get the lowest position in that particular museum. So decolonizing the museum spaces, how artifacts are organized, which artifact is kept after what, most importantly, how they are being described. What are those descriptions? Whenever we visit a museum, we often see that there is always a tendency in the museum, to generalize on the one side, and on the other side, to kind of create a false romantic celebration of certain cultures and traditions. Only certain cultures, certain traditional aspects are being picked up, and they are being generalized and quoted. Okay, this is the culture of Manipur. This is the culture of Assam. This is the culture of Nagaland. As if beyond that, they have no other cultures and traditions. So decolonizing the museum space is another very important thing within the element of systems of knowledge production. And I've brought it categorically here because de-hierarchizing and indigenizing system of knowledge production, and in the process of this knowledge production, what we find is actually that museums play a very important role. Now, coming to the fourth point, that de-hierarchizing and indigenizing the various habitual patterns of thinking and doing. Now, what I mean by the various habitual patterns of thinking and doing is very much reflected in our daily life. For example, the way I behave, the way I talk, the way I laugh, the kind of food I eat, the way I eat, the kind of dresses I like to wear, linguistic patterns, etc. Now, everybody has their own choice. Now, today, here, obviously, I am not sitting here and I'm not trying to indoctrinate anybody, on khadi culture and anything else, something like that. What I'm basically, everybody has their own preference. So if anybody is preferring Western dresses over indigenous ones, that's particular person's choice, and it doesn't mean that the person is colonized. But my intention, my focus of intention, or my focus of direction is towards the attitudes. Now, for example, let me give you some very real life examples. I don't know how many of you have observed, it is my observation, that if you're having, suppose in a roadside hotel, you are having, some chai and samosa, some like tea and samosa. Obviously, the usual trend is using hands and eating. The same thing, if it is done in a 5-star hotel, the usual tendency is to use a spoon and fork. Now, a spoon and fork, the usage of spoon and fork can be up to someone's comfort, no problem with that. But when people have this notion in the background that it is a 5-star hotel, and if I don't use a spoon and fork and eat, it shows that it's a bad culture or it's a bad cultural representation, then that is problematic for me. Now, if I prefer to speak in English, that's fine. But when this question comes up, or when this weighing comes up, that mother tongue, speaking in mother tongue is too backdated and speaking in English means modern, that is problematic for me. That is a reflection of the colonial act. And it is happening a lot. I mean, at least what happens in West Bengal, from the West Bengal perspective, I can say you, today, people take pride in speaking half Bengali, half English, and half Hindi, and creating a hodgepodge of that and speaking where you won't be able to understand anything, and that's the trend. People feel great that you didn't understand the language they are speaking. Or I have seen many parents are taking pride in saying that their child don't know their mother tongue, but they speak English fluently. It's a common thing. That is problematic for me. Because in a way, consciously or unconsciously, we are just mimicking the Western attitudes. Similarly, the very notion of being modern and the various representatives of modernity, on many occasions, you will find mimics the West blindly, nothing more than that, in terms of fashion sense, food habits, body languages, etc. The way we talk, the way we laugh. There are so many trends, and you go to the training institutions, there are some glorifying advertisements you find all across the country that they are training for your having a good body language. At the end of 6 months, you find all the 50 people talking in the same manner, all the 50 people walking in the same manner, all the 50 people standing in the same manner. They just basically convert you into robots and nothing else. And the best example can be you travel by the aeroplane and you see the behavioral patterns of the air stewards and stewardesses. The question is unnecessary why everyone has to smile every time. Very simple questions. Every time you have to smile. Whenever you look at people, you have to smile. Why? I mean, if my jaws are paining, I won't smile. Why do you have to smile exactly? The second point, you will see the way they talk, the way they walk. It's very mechanical. And you can see that there is a element of, kind of being trained in that manner. So what is happening is, in the way, this natural human expressions, natural human ways of speaking, body languages are being extracted from us, and we are simply being converted into androids. So decolonization brings our focus and questions these points. Now, obviously, having said so many great things about decolonization, does it mean that decolonization is flawless? It means that it is perfect, it has no problems? Absolutely not. But as I said you, I'm going to bring all the sides. And it is important for us to know that decolonization is not a doctrine. We have to, there are recently so many problems are coming up where decolonization is acting up like a doctrine. And it is important for us to understand that we have to free ourselves from that clutch. because post-colonization has already been infected by it. And if decolonization is also infected by this notion or this, this problem of indoctrination, then it will be extremely problematic. So what are the challenges? The first challenge is what I identify is chauvinism. Now let us take the example in the Indian case, simply in the Indian case. Now there is recently, there is for the last 5 to 6 years an extreme call. Now it has been happening for a long time, but for the 5 to 6 years there is an extreme conscious call that we have to indigenize our country in terms of commerce, in terms of trade, in terms of our education and everything. Now in this process of reckless indigenization, what is happening is we are indulging ourselves in a form of reckless radicalism. So in that reckless radicalism, we are trying to create once again some narratives as superior, some narratives as inferior. We are trying to create that certain narratives are these are authentic indigenous Indian narratives. These narratives or these practices, these behavioral patterns, these food habits, these kind of knowledge systems don't belong to India. They belong to the outsiders. They belong to the other religious groups. So every time, creating this self-other binary, every time we are creating. And this is what the colonizers used to do. So the question is, when we indulge into these kind of chauvinistic practices, we basically indulge in the exercise of what second coming in Yeats have said, that turning and turning into the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. We are consistently indulging ourselves in that same circle. We are just going round and round and round. The faces have changed, the shoes have changed, the dresses have changed, the skin color have changed, and the principalities are the same. So chauvinism is a major issue which we encounter in our daily, and not only in India, across the world it is happening. At least I have been, repetitive visits to South Africa. Right now I am a bit inclined, and I try to understand the kind of decolonial movements that are going on. That is facing the same problem, and you find, problems in Latin America. Why do you see from the continental context Latin America and North America and Europe and several other places? Second is localization. Now localization is important, and if you remember, I argued that localizing the global and globalizing the local, we have to remember this particular element, because localization has its good sides. Obviously we realize our different types of understandings. We in the process we also realize that what are the indigenous practices. We acknowledge in the process of different types of indigenous practices, different communities, cultures, traditions, religions that they have. But the point is, we should not stick ourselves or become a frog in the well. That is very important, because in that case what will happen, when we keep on localizing, and we shut our doors in that process, in that existence, we shut our doors to the other cultures and traditions, other cultural practices, what will happen is, in a way, we indulge again back to square one. That is, only my culture, it is also a form of chauvinism. Only my culture is superior, my language is superior, my fashion sense is superior, my food habits are superior, and the other food habits are inferior. They are not, their fashion sense is inferior, their language is inferior. And that is why in India we have so much of linguistic racism. It's a very common sight. People speaking in Tamil or Telugu, they are often, face the brunt. They are made fun of. Their physical structures are being made fun of. Their facial representations, their body languages are made fun of. People say, oh, they are so backdated. They are not modern. They are so unmodern. Their dresses are being made fun of. Why this happened? Because of this chauvinism that emerges out of localization. And then the other problem, which is also connected to these problems, and I briefly spoke about it, are the epistemic binaries. So when we indulge in a localization, then into a form of chauvinism, what happens is we indulge in, epistemic binaries. My culture is superior, yours is inferior. My culture is good, yours is bad. I am right, you are wrong. So we keep on indulging ourselves in these kind of epistemic binaries. And the last one is distortions. I mean, distortions have been multiple forms of stories. For the past few years, India has been making a strong effort that to recover the indigenous scientific practices the indigenous scientific, the indigenous kind of scientific practices, mathematical practices. There has been effort from different Indian scientists, scholars, researchers, academicians all across the country and across the world to revive those and to create or to show to the world that we already had science and technology prior to the invasion of the European colonizers, which is an excellent thing. And there are actually very categorical, examples. For example, how during the Vedic age, how the altars were mathematically calculated, specific mathematical, calculations are there. You have algebraic calculations as well in the process. So there are various instances, but the problem is in the process, we are indulging once again what I coin as reckless radicalism. Somewhat we are rushing too fast without conducting good research. We are indulging ourselves in a form of half-baked research. So ultimately what happens, we end up declaring the world that Lord Ganesha is the first example of plastic surgery. And there have been aeroplanes at the time of the ancient Vedic age and so on and so forth. Now the point is, from where these kind of narratives are emerging, the world will ask, anybody would ask. What are the roots of these narratives? Where it is categorically written that this particular imagery of the god is a representation of plastic surgery in ancient India. And all these statements come with maybe. I'm quoting maybe. You can read I'm pretty sure you must have read. If you have not read, you can see there are ample of articles, where the scientists are getting on the stage and they're saying maybe India was the first one, or maybe this is an instance of plastic surgery. In science, where do you have a maybe? Is there a place for a maybe in science? Where are your proofs? So whenever we indulge in this kind of exercises, whatever is happening is we are not kind of showing to the world, or we are not kind of showing to the people that we are we were great scientists. We are simply making a fool of ourselves. So we need to avoid this. And so decolonization in these versions are not at all acceptable. We have to keep in mind. We have to keep in mind these kind of flaws. Now, next, before I conclude and move into the last section, actually, so I have put this particular element here because during a lot of my interactions, a lot of my lectures, I often encounter one question, a common question, that which philosophers we should study, or which thinkers we should study to decolonize, to understand decolonization. Or once I went to deliver a lecture and I was asked a question that, okay, so these are the post-colonial scholars, this means we should not study them. So recommend us a few decolonial scholars. Let me say you, this attitude is absolutely not acceptable. We need to study everything and anything, because colonization have always taught us one thing, that there are certain emerging points of knowledge production. Only those emerging points should be acknowledged and rest should be rejected. So if we are again indulging in a kind of exercise that, okay, study these, don't study them, study these people, don't study these people, we are actually falling into the trap. So we have to come out of the trap. Now here I have just shared with you a very few names. Obviously I can't indulge, share with you all the names. But the kind of arguments that I was projecting till now with all of you, the kind of reflections that I was sharing with all of you till now, the point is, you see, these kind of reflections are based on some of the philosophies and theories of some of the philosophers and theories across the globe whom I have mentioned here. And there are several others. The point is, we need to read everything. You will see a tendency. I'll give you one small example. There are many publishing houses, obviously for the sake of security, and also, I personally indulge with them, so I won't name them in the process. But for the sake of security, I'll not name them. But in the process, I would like to tell you there are a lot of publishing houses who will accept your article only and only if you cite articles from definite specific sources which are acknowledged only by those publishing houses. If you don't cite them, they immediately throw it out as inauthentic. So the practice of this, creating knowledge hierarchies has spread in various versions, various other versions. in terms of references that you use, in terms of the topics that you choose, in terms of the arguments that you put forward. So it is important for us to collectively work together to break these kind of hierarchies, which is very important. And that is why I have given you some of the thinkers and philosophers which are there in front of you. Many of them have their articles, open editions, open access, all put on the website. You can open up and read them. And let me tell you, there are very few philosophers, and it's an honest thing, there are very few philosophers who actually claim that I am a decolonial theorist. Or there are very few philosophers that I am a post-colonial theorist. In other words, there are very few philosophers who categorize them within these specific schools. Otherwise, most of the philosophers, and as you see, most of them they are in front of you, they don't categorize them within these schools. They acknowledge the differences, they put forward their arguments, they put forward their agreements and disagreements, and how it is possible. And that is only the way in which we should actually make an effort to de-hierarchize knowledge. Even if we dislike somebody's ideologies, we need to read that person. We need to read that person, categorically understand what the person wants to say, wishes to say, and then only we should go ahead with the exercise of disagreement. And that actually what leads us towards constructive criticism. Otherwise, what happens is, we usually see what happens in the social media sites, like first couple of arguments and then personal mishmashing. You personally bash each other, somebody argumentative, somebody's religion is questioned, somebody's gender is questioned, somebody's family is questioned. When do we get in all this kind of indulgences? Because we don't have enough critical, categorical, sensible points to argue and disagree with each other. So holistic reading altogether is very important. Now with this, I'll come to the third and the final part of my lecture, that is decolonizing post-colonization. And what do I mean by that? Now, decolonizing post-colonization, the first thing is shattering the bad faith. And if you read the works of Lewis Gordon, I don't know if you're working in African existentialism, Afro-American philosophy, Africana philosophy, African philosophy, etc., Black existentialism, Black theories and all. He's quite a big name. And Louis Ricardo Gordon actually argues, Professor Gordon argues that, this shattering the bad faith is important. Colonization actually has created a lot of bad faiths within us. So, bad faith actually leads us to a selfishness. We see that my problem is only my problem. My solution is only my solution. So if I am happy, if I am satisfied, if I have all the basic needs of life, it means the world is happy. This is the bad faith, living for each other, contributing towards each other's knowledges, contributing towards each other's welfare. These elements are gradually eroding. So we need to shatter the bad faith that someone else's problem is not only that problem of that individual. We need to share the problem with us as well. We need to be each other's, we need to respect each other's humanity. We should come and help each other irrespective of their positionality, irrespective of their understanding, irrespective of their agreements and disagreements. We need to come to, we need to help each other and understand, what are the various ways we can, we can transform humanitarian manner, we can transform each other on a humanitarian basis. That is very important. Secondly, whenever we talk about knowledges, we talk about knowledge structures, we have our own reflections, we have our own belief patterns, we have our own associations. It is important for us to remember that whatever we learn or whatever we know is a non-conclusive knowledge. We need to ask more questions rather than delivering statements. Statements are very problematic. We need to have more questions and less answers. Every question, we need to acknowledge the fact that every question cannot have an answer. Some questions can lead to more set of questions. That is a way of answering. So non-conclusion of knowledge. Knowledge is ever expanding, it's continuing. We have to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean that whatever I know, whatever I have actually in my mind, or whatever I learn is the ultimate end of it. I should be open to other forms of knowledge as well. And this is actually, again, Lewis Gordon talks about this element of, pedagogical diversity. That is where every day before we share knowledge, we acknowledge the fact that whatever I know is not the end of it. I should know, I should learn more and more. That actually leads to the third point, that knowledge production has to be converted to knowledge sharing. It is very important that knowledge production should be avoided. We should not indulge ourselves in the process of knowledge production. It's a very capitalist thing. This is only leading to the generation of industries, factories, and laboratories of knowledges, where knowledges are produced in certain laboratories and they are being disseminated globally. That this is the ultimate structure. This is the ultimate framework. You have to follow and you have to disseminate. Preach. Go across the world and preach. These kind of indoctrinated practices, we have to refrain from that. So instead of thinking ourselves as producers of knowledge, what we need to do is we need to be knowledge sharers. Immediately when we indulge in this process of sharing knowledge, what happens is we are open to new knowledge frameworks as well. We share, we learn and we share. It's a consistent, continuous circular exercise. Fourth, when we talk about theories, when we talk about philosophies, theoretical and philosophical dimensions should emerge from our self-experiences. Then only diversity can come up. Otherwise, what we will do is we will end up, begging at the feet of those existing European horse heads. 5 to 6 people, they have given certain segments of theories or a set of white theorists. They have given their theories. They are the ultimate grand narratives. They cannot be questioned. You forcefully apply them. You keep on applying. So to break away from this very problematic practice, it is important that this process of theorization should come from our self-experiences. Whenever it emerges from our respective self-experiences, you will see in the process, or we all will see in the process, that different dimensions of de-hierarchical theoretical understandings are coming. We are not just indulging or suffocating ourselves in certain existing compartments. We are generating new perspectives. We are breaking away the compartments and we are creating open spaces of understandings. Now, these practices altogether will lead us to border thinking. For generating our thoughts, for generating our perspectives, we don't have to jump into the center, because the center is very problematic. This center is very hierarchical. This center is unidirectional. This center is unidimensional. So, these centers, we have to refrain from being at those centers. So, border thinking is very, very crucial for all of us. It's very, very important that we stay at our borders. And what I mean by the borders, not just the physical borders. Physical borders are actually very, very important. And what is also important is that we need to understand the cultural borders, political borders, communal borders. We need to stand in these positions and we need to talk. Our voices will be heard from our borders. We don't need to stand in the center, because the center is very problematic. Because once we are in the center, we will be oriented. Once we are in the center, we will be pushed into those ideologies and ethics consistently. So to avoid being at the center, what we need to do is we need to understand, we need to acknowledge that we will all agree to disagree with each other. And that is why at the beginning I say that I'm very happy with disagreements. If more disagreements come and less agreements, I feel that we create more and more de-hierarchical spaces of new thought processes. So we don't need to say a yes for every yes. We don't need to say a no for every no. What is important is we disagree with each other. That, okay, whatever you have said, I don't accept. But let us do it in a very agreeable manner. That you will not accept me, I will not accept you. We will constructively criticize each other, but also we will collaborate in that constructive criticism to generate new dimensions of thoughts and ideas. And finally, which is very famous in our WhatsApp messages and all. You'll see all, Ubuntu. But this famous saying of Ubuntu, which is an Ubuntu, Uhuru, and there are several other African sayings. This entire saying is Ubuntu in Gumuntu in Gabantu, which is actually means I am because who we all are. If we indulge in all these kind of exercises, which is obviously not a one-day thing, because we have to remember we were colonized altogether. If we look into the general process of colonization, which starts from Christopher Columbus's so-called voyages of discovery, we were colonized for 500 years or more. So obviously, having said these things, tomorrow I can't wake up and be decolonized. We just can't do it in a one day. So to unshoulder that burden of 500 years, it is a consistent process with multiple forms of challenges, multiple forms of disagreements, multiple levels of failure. But this is a consistent process of revolution. This is a consistent process of resistance. It's an unceasing process of resistance. That is because always, if you remember what Audre Lorde has said, that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. So we have to make sure that let neither the master's tools nor the master's house exist. And how can we do that? By indulging in all these exercises with one specific aim, and that is we have to consistently practice, not just remember, not just acknowledge, not just speak up, but practice in our daily life that I am because who we all are, acknowledging each other's humanitarian existence in the process. Thank you so much. Here I stop.
Thank you, Sayan. I hope I'm audible, Sayan.
Yes.
I can well just say that there are more than 260 participants now still after your such a fluid and such an interesting and engaging lecture, which clearly testifies the fact of the engaging lecture that you just now concluded. Now, there are plethora of messages who are appreciating your very well lucid and very interesting lecture presentation. So I'm sure that you are habituated of such kind of compliments since the time you have been given such giving such engaging presentations. Attention is to the interesting questions that I have received, and I would like to share those questions with you. And if possible, the first question is from Dr. Rupali Jain. She asks you that how does post-colonial theory helps in identity formation?
Well, this is actually a very expansive question. I really don't know where to start and where to stop. Actually, this identity question is actually, it's a very ambivalent space, this very identity. Now, the question is, how do we start? What kind of identity we are talking about? We are talking about a racial identity, communal identity, gendered identity, our work identity, workplace identity. So there are various layers and sub-layers to it. Now, the point is, this very, question of identity formation, in the post-colonial world, at least within the Indian perspective, which generally, if I take the Indian perspective, we have inherited, consciously, unconsciously, whatever manner, we have inherited a lot of, colonial constructs, colonial notions of identity formations. And that's basically what I was talking about when I was talking about the behavioral patterns. Now we have this institutions who controls our identity. We have the family institution, we have the societal institution, we have the educational institution, we have the training institutions who always, teach us or try to teach us how we should talk, how we should love. I'm pretty sure you must be aware of the fact that there are a lot of offices or a lot of training institutions who teaches you that where to laugh, how to laugh, in whatever manner you're going to laugh. So if you're in front of your boss, how you're going to laugh. If you're in front of your friends, how you're going to laugh. If you're sitting in a roadside restaurant shack, how you're going to laugh. If you're sitting in a 5-star restaurant, how you're going to laugh. So in a roadside shack, you can laugh out loud, but in a 5-star restaurant, people are going to look at you as if you are one of the most uncivilized beings. So you see, these practices that are taking place, now these are all playing a crucial part in the identity formation. So altogether in the post-colonial era, I believe, at least within the Indian perspective, this element of identity formation is actually still a lot we mimic the Western standards of identity formation, where our free-flowing expressions are being very much controlled, they are arrested, and at a lot of points of time, they are being extracted from us and thrown up. And we are being consistently put into a consistent exercise of expropriations and appropriations of different identities.
Thank you. Next question is by Mintu Paul. He says that how can theory of decolonization be applied with the light of deconstruction theory?
Okay, well, let me tell you, it's a very interesting question because a lot of so-called scholars who indulge in the notion of decoloniality, they are very much influenced by Derrida's notion of decolonization. I mean, as one I have mentioned in the list, you will see Rosina Mart. She works on the notion of decolonizing gender studies in South Africa, and she's quite a prominent name. You can find her out on Google and all. Professor Rosina Mart's works are widely influenced by Derridian construction of notion of deconstruction. Now, a lot of decolonizing scholars, having said that, they are influenced by Derrida's notion of deconstruction. And most importantly, Derrida is perceived mostly as a white scholar, but Derrida was a part of, he is originally from Algeria. So his roots are in Africa. We often forget that. Point number one. Point number two, Derridian notion of deconstruction is very much applied in, because we know what is the notion of deconstruction. In general, in a simplistic form, we question the established structures, we break it, and we try to frame new structures. But there is also a section of critics who see that Derrida's concept of deconstruction was only applicable within the privileged white West, which actually Frantz Fanon, in his seminal work, The Wretched of the Earth, Damnée de la Terre, he argues as the zone of being. So often critics argue that this notion of deconstruction is very much applied within the European privileged colonial perspective. So that has to be brought out, that grand narrative, colonially constructed grand narrative need to be broken. And so deconstruction need to be deconstructed further, decolonially deconstructed, and then re-understood within the indigenous perspectives. But I can share with you one thing, that for sure, Derrida's notion of deconstruction is very much acknowledged and applied by various decolonial scholars in their theories and philosophies and in their practical works as well.
Next question is from Dr. Rohini. She is a faculty in Patna University. How could decolonization of mind be possible for those who belongs to extremely backward community?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And I'd like to tell you that there is no set norms and regulations. Now, what could be the possibilities of doing it, which also doesn't ensure whether it will be successful or not. But again, as I said, we need to keep on fighting. We need to keep on resisting. The point is, first and the foremost thing, we need to have the collective effort. We need to ensure that we are not going to hire somebody from, so suppose if I belong to a community, a backward community, now from various dimensions of backwardness, it can be a caste, class, race, gender, whatever. If I belong to a backward community, it is important for me and my community to understand that in order to voice our own self, it is important to keep in mind that we are not going to hire somebody from outside and tell us what we are supposed to do and what we are not supposed to do. That's why the question of can the subaltern speak remains a question only. Till now, it has not been answered. Because still, the subalterns are being represented by the privileged classes of people. And I won't go for the further debate because somewhat I find the very notion of the subaltern can speak is an ironical question, because who himself, like the writer herself, indulges non-subaltern activities and presents herself as a subaltern, voice of the subalterns, etc. That's a different element of debate. We can talk about it later for sure. But yes, this question remains unanswered because still look into privilege to come out and speak first. We exclusively depend on the NGOs, social workers, city people, corporate fundings, etc., to come and tell us or talk about us, the underprivileged people, that what we're supposed to do, what we're not. So first and the foremost thing, we have to avoid that. We have to organize our own self. If I am belonging to a backward community, I and my own community members need to organize ourselves and present our own cultures, traditions to the world, and tell the world the first most important message, that we can speak for ourselves. We don't need any privileged voice to represent us. That is the first step, I believe. And that first step can be put forward in terms of cultural presentations, in terms of reflections, in terms of cultural practices and several other elements. We need to give this message to them first, or not exactly we, but those underprivileged people, the so-called underprivileged people, need to deliver this message to the world first. So this could be the first step of approach, and then several approaches might follow in the process.
Next, we have Dr. Muhammad Akram from Burewala, Pakistan. His question is, how would you address the concept of culture / cultural influence in hierarchizing and indigenizing our own self?
Can you please just repeat the question once? I didn't get the complete one.
How would you address the concept of culture / cultural influence in hierarchizing and indigenizing our own self?
Well, that practice emerges. The first thing is, it is very important for us to know our forefathers properly. It is very important for us to know what are my cultural roots. What are the roots of my forefathers? What cultures they have taught to my family line, to my clan, to my community? What kind of cultural practices they had? In other words, it is very important for me to know where are my historical roots. The first thing. Now, historical roots doesn't just mean that I'm looking at my history and I'm writing a research paper and getting it published and my story is over. Now, what are the historical practices, the cultural practices, medical practices, different other things? Let me tell you a very interesting story with respect to it, and you will get a brief idea. I was talking about Professor Gordon, and I think Professor Gordon is like quite a reputed name in Pakistan, because I have a lot of scholar friends from Pakistan who speaks high of Professor Gordon, and he was one of the person who got infected with COVID-19, and right now he's in the process of recovery, almost recovered. Now, when I was communicating with him over, Skype and all, we usually have a, very, very strong communication almost on a daily basis. He was sharing that how he, indulged himself in the process of recovery. You won't believe, he didn't take in the process of recovery, he didn't take a single element, of any artificial allopathic medicines. His recovery was completely based on home remedies, and which he says that he has inherited it from his forefathers. How through different homemade remedies he has healed his own body. So you see, this is a form of cultural practice that you bring, or we can all bring in our regular patterns of our existence, and we can resist the existing knowledge patterns, the existing scientific patterns of the Western knowledge production. This is one small example. And we can do it with everything. We can do it through cultural practices like dance forms, like musical forms, like educational patterns. knowledge patterns, knowledge systems, curricular structures, etc.
Next question is from Dr. Robert G. from Philippine University. He is asking that is diaspora a process of decolonization?
Well, diaspora process of decolonization, it can be both ways. I mean, the question is, now some questions that we need to, I think at least I, need to frame if I'm looking into this matter of decolonization. The first question is under what circumstance, I mean, historical, social, cultural, political circumstance, a diasporic community was created. Most of the diasporic communities, they were created out of, out of an enforcement. They left their country, they left their geographical places, or they were taken as slaves, indentured laborers that you find in the Caribbean islands, that you find in widely in Africa. One point, you can see there are many people who left their country because of their own country, because they were displaced, they were alienated by their own culture, that frustrated them, that alienated them, and they have been in the diasporic community. So the diaspora emerges from severe crisis. Mostly it emerges from severe crisis. You will hardly find any people will say, I have been a part of the diasporic community because I wanted to. Very few. Now the question is, it depends which diasporic community, developed under what circumstances. First question. Question number two is, if that diasporic community emerges from the indentured laborer, how they have transformed themselves with the passage of time. Now, for a culture of a diasporic community is a amalgamation of different cultures and traditions. They will take something from the country where they reside in. They will have some from their own country. They will take something from the colonizers, and they will have a mishmash of cultural practices. So if we have to address, I mean, right now, obviously, I don't have an answer that yes or no. It is not a yes or no question, in fact, for me. For me, it's a question that generates further questions. So we need to go back and ask these questions before we analyze whether it's a, it's a colonial element, they are still colonized, or how they are trying to decolonize. That these questions will only arise only if we look into these, roll back into these questions. Now, coming to South Africa specifically, I can say you, the indentured laborers that were taken, who were taken by the British colonizers to KwaZulu-Natal, mainly in the Natal province, you will find a lot of Indians, Durban, Natal, all those regions you will see. Now, they make a strong effort to decolonize themselves by going back, doing extensive research. If you look into the works of Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Wahed, those are two very, very prominent voices of writing about diasporic cultures and traditions in South Africa. They have some open-ended articles as well. You will see how they are trying to recollect their family traditions, family customs. They have created their own library where they are archiving their cultures and traditions. So they, in a way, that diasporic community of indentured laborers, they are trying to decolonize in this manner. So now it depends in which particular country or which particular region the persons reside, or the community reside altogether.
Vinay Dangar, Dr. Vinay Dangar is asking a question that I quote him. Are you talking against standardization of anything? If so, who are responsible for standardization of everything in our society?
Well, absolutely. I have a problem with standardization. And in a way, though I didn't mention the word, but thank you for bringing this question, I have a problem with standardization. And who are making the standardization? In a way, we are all doing it. In a way, we are, at the moment I say, at this point, the moment I say that whatever I am saying, these are the only ways of decolonizing, there can be no other ways of decolonizing. I have given you 10 parameters, follow it and you will be decolonized. I am standardizing decolonization. That is a problem. And we can do, everybody can of us do. When we go, there are a lot of tutors I have encountered in my own life. There are a lot of tutors who go into the class, and before starting the class, they simply say that whatever I teach you, you have to write only those answers in your answer sheet. If you write something else of your own notion and ideas, you will be failed in the exam. That is standardization. So we can all be a part of it. There is like no specific faces. We can all be a part of it. Whoever of us have the voice, whoever of us has the privilege, epistemic privilege, systematic privilege, we are all in the, consciously or unconsciously, we indulge in this exercise.
I will add his one more question, which is very interesting. He says that it's not the English, means what he means is, don't you think English language is helping us to continue our colonial legacy?
Absolutely. I mean, I have no doubt with it. And this, as I said to you at the beginning, that I grapple with this notion of decolonization. We are all indulged in the English language. And especially in the linguistics, we often, in the most of the linguistic syllabus, we see that we have this history of English language origination, or we often study what is British English, what is American English, or the English linguistic connotations with respect to phonetic transcriptions that we study are based on British and American English. So we have this problem. There are certain things we cannot overturn, we cannot change. But it doesn't mean that we will accept it in the established forms. That is why we have Indian English, we have chutneyfied English, like as said by Salman Rushdie. We have Biryanized English, as said by Agha Shahid Ali. We use English words, we join it with local native words and we use it. We have a South African Standard English. We have a Malaysian Standard English, Malay English. In fact, I mean, anybody who is, if there is anybody from Malaysia, will be able to obviously say better than me that how this Malay English, mixing up Malay words, Malay is the language, Malay words with English words, and using it as a part of daily communication in the written form as well. So everything cannot be dismantled, but resistances can be prepared. So obviously, having said that we are still, English language is a colonial language, absolutely. But we are in such a scenario that it is not very easy to do away with. I won't say anything is impossible, but at the same time, I will say it is not so easy to do away with. But there are various ways in which we can create resistances.
Dr. Monali Chatterjee from Ahmedabad, Gujarat. She asks you a direct question. Swami Vivekananda perceived colonization as a form of enforced reformation. What is your take on that?
Well, yes, it's true as a form of enforced reformation. And the question of enforced reformation obviously cannot be denied. It is a form of enforced reformation. But let me tell you, how do I understand this notion of enforcement? For me, it is not only coercion, it is a form of seduction as well. Now, when we indulge with these forms of narratives of enforcement, usually, I'm not saying every time, usually what we see is we have this unidirectional notion that, okay, the white colonizers came, they enforced their language, their culture, and everything upon us, and they went. But you see, enforcement is not such an easy thing. And if you look into the colonization pattern of the European colonizers in India, it was very different from Africa. In Africa, it was mostly of physical abuses. But in India, obviously, physical abuse was there. Ample of physical abuse took place. But you will see a major element or major part of the strategy was also metaphysical abuse or psychological abuse. So they also tried to seduce us. So when we have to understand this enforcement, yes, I mean, what Vivekananda said, this element of enforcement, it's absolutely very, very true. It's absolutely very, very true that this enforcement was there, but also it is important to understand what kind of enforcement we are talking about. Enforcement both in the form of coercion, that is physical violence, or violent enforcement, and at the time of seduction as well. Many people who were attracted to Christian religion, many people were attracted to the English language, till That's why we have this extreme strong affinity towards English language. That's why we have this extreme strong affinity when we teach our school students. I have been a school teacher for some period of time, where I found every teacher teaching the students saying that if you have to learn good English, you have to watch BBC News, you have to watch CNBC, you have to watch Star movies. I mean, that actually shows the way how much we were seduced by that element of enforcement.
Dr. Ajita Bhattacharya, because you talked about West Bengal and English and the importance of English in West Bengal. So from that perspective, I have a question from Dr. Ajita Bhattacharya. She says that could this intense attraction for speaking in English in West Bengal be credited to the fact that modern Renaissance began in Bengal?
Well, one reason is for sure. I mean, what you have mentioned, one reason is for the sure. And modern Renaissance obviously was widely influenced by this teaching of English as a language. We still hear, like even in our respective families, from our fathers, from our grandfathers, we used to hear that how they used to boast about the fact that some of the greatest English professors, how they were so wonderful in speaking English, how they used to remember the quotations and every poetry and everything with respect to, from Shakespeare's plays and all, which is a wonderful thing. I mean, that actually acknowledges a credibility, that doesn't take away. But you see, the intention of praise, that is, they used to speak English like a British, they never sounded like an Indian. So that was an element of pride. And this, this pride is this feeling of pride of speaking English like a British, like an American, like a Scottish, like an Irish, is a very much an influence of the Bengal Renaissance. So I totally agree with you.
Then Dr. Sharija Menon, she says that how does one deal with hierarchies of and power structures within the realms of knowledge, especially in terms of not defying Western theories as the norm, aside researchers if they don't follow the norm. I do believe that good research needs a standardization manner of correlating theory and practice. Here is the question. But she asks, whose prerogative is the manner or form of standardization?
What was the last question? Whose
prerogative is the manner or form of standardization?
Well, basically, when we talk about this manners and standards of standardization, these elements of research standardization, what we usually see is that these books, MLA edition or APAs and whatever, we follow the Chicago style, and the manuals that we are made to study during our courseworks, research courseworks and all, they're all shaped up by Western scholars, Western historians, or Western critics who are from the privileged position of the colonial West. And by that, I mean both Europe, widely colonial Europe, as well as also widely, the US as well. So the point is, like, obviously, when we write a research, now if I go into the very technical element, when we write a research paper, irrespective of the subjective field that we indulge into, obviously we have certain basic standards we follow. But the problem happens is there is a tendency of universalization, where every time we indulge in the process of research writing, we have so many research methodologies, workshop, and 7 days, 10 days, and this and that. And where we see basically a parroting of certain standards and ideologies which are shaped by the privileged colonial West. Now, certain things are applicable, certain things may not be applicable. Why? Because we stand in our respective geographical position, cultural position, political position. So we need to, recontextualize them. If that is not getting contextualized at all, we need to throw it away out. We need to just, disown them. But the question is, does our institutions allow us to do that? In most of the cases, we find it doesn't allow us to do that. We are forced to put our research within certain templates which are being set up by the colonial West. So this very templated research is very problematic. That is why we come out with repetitive research. That is the research, instead of reorganized search or renewed search, what we end up doing is a repetitive search. So we need to understand that from where these parameters are coming out, and accordingly we have to own and disown, and we need to develop that space for that. And that space could be developed not individually. I mean, I can't write a research and say I am decolonizing. That is not, it's not possible in that. We need to have a collective effort. And that is, I think, for that we need to identify who are, still dictating us.
Now, I have an interesting question, which rather, takes us to a different point of view of decolonization. It's just an observation come a question by Professor Dr. Elizabeth. She's a professor in Kamrup College, Assam. She says that, are we just mimicking others' culture? Or can this be a question of change in our choices and preferences as we move forward, because change is inherent and inevitable in terms of livelihood, lifestyle, culture, and so on?
Well, the question is how we are changing. If change is coming by mimicry, that is, I find absolutely problematic. If change is coming by embracing, now embracing and mimicry are two different things. Now, for example, I am changing. Okay, I am giving up I want to be modern. I am giving up my own mother tongue, and I want to learn only foreign language. That is my version of change, for instance. I think that is very problematic. Now, the second question is, I am changing that, okay, I know what are my cultural practices, but also I want to venture out of my cultural practice, keeping my cultural practices, my habits, and all these beliefs at the background. I want to embrace A, B, C, D, E, F, these cultural traditions as well. They are extremely attractive. They're very nice. I feel like I can blend my culture with them. Or even if I don't blend, I keep my culture with mine, but also I indulge or imbibe those cultural practices as well. That is perfectly fine. That is wonderful. So my question is how I am indulging in the process of change. If it is happening through mimicry, that is very problematic. If it is happening through acknowledging other cultures and traditions with respect to my own, that is wonderful.
I really appreciate Dr. Sayan with the straightforward answers that you are, expressing yourself and straightforwardly putting across. It's good to see from a young scholar like you. Next question from Dr. Soham Pain from West Bengal, and I quote him, because you referred to Malaysia, could you kindly suggest any works on the role and status of the English language and literature in Southeast Asia?
Well, talking about works, role of English language and literature in Southeast Asia, immediately, I mean, one particular work that is coming, and that is not actually a work, immediately one particular thing is coming in my mind. That is if you look into the Malay English dictionary. Okay, now why I say now dictionary is not a fictional or non-fictional work, but why I refer to the dictionary. Because if you look at the Malay English dictionary, you will see that how, this amalgamation of English words with Malay words have taken place. And how do they use it in a daily language without even thinking of translating them? Because we have this very, very usual tendency of translating everything in English. For example, being in Bhutan, it makes me feel more prominent. Like, there are a lot of spices, there are a lot of vegetables, a lot of other elements which cannot be translated immediately. So in the grocery shop, when I go, often I have a problem. So what I have to do is I have to carry a sample and show it to them, say this is something I want. So this European colonizers, they have not only imposed their language upon us, they have also taught us how to indulge in the process of translating everything into their language. So that's why I recommend the Malay English dictionary. But thank you for this question. In fact, what I'll try to do is, I'll do one thing. I'll just share my email ID with you. so that, if you like, give me some time, I can obviously look for some works and some fictional and non-fictional works that centers around this particular topic and send to you. So if you can be very kind enough and send me your email with a hi, and we can be in touch and we can just, go into the process.
Dr. Sayan, Dr. Soham is also one of our resource persons. So definitely,
Okay,
I will be happy to share his email ID with you. And at the
wonderful.
same time, I would like to inform you. I would like to request you that if it is possible, I will accumulate these questions and I will email to you. And if
Okay, that's fine.
you take your time, and if possible, please do answer those. We plan to include these lecture questions in various issues of GNOSIS. So that is our
Okay, okay.
intention. So we will do that also. And at the same time, this video will be uploaded in YouTube within few days time after editing, of course. And as some of our participants have demanded the PPT, so I would like to inform the participants that the PPT will be in the video itself, which will be shared by me. And as I said to you all, that whenever, if you feel like even dealing or taking an idea also from Dr. Sayan's presentation, please don't forget to acknowledge him. It will be our last two questions, Dr. Sayan, if you permit.
Yeah, please. No problem.
Dr. Bhavna Vij Arora, her question is, would you please reflect on the politics of decolonization, especially by the cultural dictates on the process of Indianization and appropriation of cultural symbols, heritages, etc.? Isn't this an eternal loop of exerting power by one over the other? And what possible solutions could be offered? So it's a one question come three questions.
Okay, yes. I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. And in fact, as I was talking about while talking about my points, that does it mean that decolonization should not be critiqued? It should be blindly accepted. And there, one of the points, if you remember, I was talking about this very basic thing that this is a practice of chauvinism, that we often indulge in the process of decolonization. And with recently, I think this problem has erupted massively. This problem has come up massively, that what is Indian culture? Now, this very question, what is an Indian culture, when we ask, even before looking for an answer to it, we ask the very wrong question. Because there cannot be one Indian culture, there cannot be an Indian culture, or there cannot be the Indian culture. We need to ask the right question first. Now, because we end up asking the wrong question, we end up giving up the wrong answers. So this is why in India, what is happening right now in the name of decolonization, what is happening, we are taking the decolonization towards a completely wrong direction. What we are doing consciously or unconsciously, we are simply fooling ourselves. We are just getting stuck in the very existing hierarchies, the kind of divisions, the kind of hegemonies that were created once by the European colonizers. We are simply building up upon those. That is why we see we target certain communities, we target certain genders, we target certain people from certain geographical backgrounds, religious backgrounds, by their physical appearances, etc. So we are failing. I totally admit this, that we are failing. Now the possibilities are those. Now, as you talk about the possibilities, obviously the possibilities is we need to question ourselves first. Our problem is, I always feel our problem is, we're always ready to say what you have to do. Okay, you need to do this. We sit like, dictats. We sit like those preachers. Once the colonial preachers came with their, Bibles, and they did the same thing to us. And across the world, we are doing the same things. Okay, you need a solution. Okay, let me tell you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. These are the solution. Apply it as if it is a kind of medicine. We capsulate them, the solutions. We turn the solutions into a capsule, and then we force feed the people. From that point, we have to refrain. Let people understand their own solution. Let first understand, let me share my own thoughts. Let people disagree, let people agree, no problem. Let people understand their own solutions. Instead of being force-fed, we need to realize our own solution. And even if we realize our own solution, that is important we do through the process of self-reflection. Before even saying someone else, decolonize yourself, the first question I ask myself, how much I am decolonized? And if I'm not, how I am going to do that?
Lovely. A very budding scholar, PhD scholar, Sangram Chetri from FLU Shillong campus. His question is, sir, I quote him, sir, would love to hear from you about the hybrid culture that develops with colonizer and colonized relationship.
Yeah, so this hybridization, which actually our very, respected, one of the respected theoreticians, Homi Bhabha, have talked about, this hybridization is a very problematic process. This term hybrid itself is a very problematic process. We often indulge in terms, isn't it? Hybridization, transculturalism, multiculturalism, and they sound, multifaceted terms, beautiful terms, apply them, code them, nourish them, nurture them. But when it comes to applicability, the reality is very wrong. Why the reality is problematic? The reality is problematic because even in these kind of hybridization, one culture maintains the hierarchy over the other culture. One culture decide with whom they are going to hybridize. One definite cultural narrative or a set of privileged cultural narratives decide that what will be the positionality of the other culture. So within even this notion of hybridization, this I and other is very much there. So in a way, we have to refrain from hybridization. If we are hybridizing somewhere, somewhat, we are losing in the quagmire of that dominant culture. And we are oriented, we are actually, psychologically manipulated to such an extent that we lose our own elements and own perspectives of existence, our roots, we get derooted. And this basically again connects to this question. One of the scholars who have asked, one of the faculties, I guess, who have asked about, about the diasporic cultures and traditions. The diaspora faces this problem of hybridization a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Sayan. Before we end, of course, after such a long, interesting, and captivating lecture, there are some scholars and members from academia. This question might be, it is from them. One of them has asked, but I think this question might have cropped among many. The question, as I put, is from Dr. Kamana Srivastav. She's an assistant professor in Lucknow. But I'm sure this question might be coming to many out here. The question is, what do you think? Will total decolonization be possible?
No. First of all, I have a problem with this question. And here I come with this notion of agree to disagree. Now, why do I disagree with your question? There is nothing called total. Once we indulge ourselves in this notion of totalism, we are back to those colonial narratives. There cannot be anything total. As I said you, once we indulge in this narratives of totality, we start manufacturing capsules and force feed people. We have to refrain from that. And this is my personal belief. Again, you are free to disagree with me. Because when we say total decolonization, what happens is we are trying to generate a grand narrative. We are trying to create certain specific parameters that, okay, these are the things let us do, and we will do a total decolonization. So the point is, total decolonization is never possible. It is a consistent struggle. Because remember one thing, we were never totally colonized. Even we were not totally colonized. If we would have been totally colonized, we would have never indulged or ever thought about the process of decolonization. So if there has not been total colonization, the question of total decolonization doesn't arrive. There is always a space Gateways are always open. The back door is also open. The front door is also open. We have to work in that manner. So this is a consistent struggle of resistance. It's a never ending struggle of resistance. So according to me, total decolonization, the notion is very problematic for.
Well, Dr. Sayan, there are many questions which, given the time foundation, we are already over half an hour more into our time. Thank you very much on behalf of Team GNOSIS to have spared so much of time, and I'm sure in the near future you will be an integral part of GNOSIS as well, as we have discussed. And I'm sure this talk which you have presently given, this lecture, definitely have given directions and ideas to many of the upcoming scholars as well as our academicians who are a part of this lecture, and they will explore this area, which is no doubt a very interesting one. I teach a lot of African literature in my university, so I know it's a very interesting field. And on behalf of Team GNOSIS, Dr. Sayan, it is really a great honor to have you. And we wish that if you have some time, please do spare that, I'll mail you. And at the same time, if possible, please do join for some of the sessions that we will be holding from tomorrow, continuation till at least 7th of June. Thank you, Dr. Sayan, so much. And just for information to you all and Dr. Sayan as well, tomorrow we have a very interesting and fascinating lecture coming up. And it's on a new, genre. It's on a new field of study which has cropped up in the last 10-15 years in India, especially, that is digital humanities. So tomorrow, digital humanities will be the topic of the lecture, which will be delivered by one of the very renowned professors of India, Professor Sachin Ketkar. The details by afternoon tomorrow. So please don't hurry. I told you before 1 hour, I'll share the details. Don't worry, you will receive it in your mail. Please do join us for Professor Sachin Ketkar's lecture tomorrow on digital humanities. Thank you, Dr. Sayan, once again. Thank you, Dr. Sayan. You'd be surprised. We still have online 140 participants who are a part of this lecture till now, after 2 hours almost. That clearly shows the kind of engrossing and enthralling and informative lecture which you have just delivered, especially the question answers. The way you have answered definitely gives and scholars definitely to have this go-to attitude and speak out the heart, which slowly is subsiding day by day in our academia. Thank you, Dr. Sayan. Thank you, participants, for joining. Tomorrow, 5:30 again, we will meet on digital humanities.
And thank you so much. I mean, thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee. And also, I mean, I'm very much touched and humbled by the wonderful set of questions. I wish I could answer each and every questions, but again, I am sincerely requesting each and everyone who are there. My email ID is there. I'm pretty sure Dr. Banerjee will also share the questions. In fact, if anybody have questions, agreements, disagreements, whatever is there, please feel free to email me. I'm very happy to connect, develop this interaction ahead and look into the broader perspective. So thank you once again to all of you for giving me this humble space, for giving me this humble opportunity to share my thoughts, to reflect upon, and also most importantly, to learn a lot from all of you. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you all. See you tomorrow at 5:20. Thank you so much.